India is facing this massive public health puzzle, and you'd think it's a crisis all about infrastructure, right? But what we're about to discover is that it's actually a story about people, culture, and some really deep-seated traditions. So what if a country built millions and millions of toilets, and people just refused to use them? I mean, that question gets right to the heart of this whole paradox. The solution seemed so simple, just build more toilets. But that idea ran smack into a much more complex human reality. So let's break down exactly why that happened. Okay, to really get the urgency here, you have to look at the numbers behind this crisis. And believe me, this isn't just some inconvenience. We're talking about a daily reality with absolutely devastating consequences for millions of people. Let's start with this number, 450 million. Just let that sink in for a second. That's the number of people in India who often have no other choice but to relieve themselves out in the open. To put that in perspective, that's more than the entire population of the United States. It's just staggering. And of course, the health impact is immense. All of that waste, it ends up contaminating water, the soil, and that leads to widespread disease. The result? Well, 1 out of every 10 deaths in India is linked directly to poor sanitation. But maybe the most tragic part of all this is the impact on the next generation. We're talking about nearly 44 million children suffering from stunted growth. What that means is they get these chronic infections that stop their little bodies from absorbing nutrients properly. It's just this devastating cycle that can affect a child's entire future. So, faced with this really grim reality, the Indian government decided to do something huge. They launched one of the most ambitious public works projects in modern history. The goal seemed pretty straightforward: end open defecation by building toilets for absolutely everyone. And to tackle this, they launched a massive program with an equally massive budget, $29 billion. The idea was to subsidize toilet construction and, in theory, put a latrine in every single household that needed one. And this initiative, it actually drew inspiration from the nation's founder himself, Mahatma Gandhi. He believed sanitation was more important than political freedom. He saw it as something sacred, a fundamental pillar for a healthy, dignified society. So the government's plan was really seen as fulfilling this long-held national vision. So the plan was incredibly ambitious. Millions of toilets were built. But when officials started looking at the results, they uncovered this really puzzling mystery. This is what they found. In a staggering 40% of homes that actually had a working toilet, at least one person was still choosing to go outside. I mean, the toilets were there, but millions of them were just going unused. So this begs the crucial question, why? Why are the toilets staying empty? And it turns out the answer wasn't the obvious stuff, like faulty construction or lack of water. It was about something much deeper. The real reasons? Well, they're a complex tangle of cultural habits, practical concerns, and a social hierarchy that's been in place for centuries. And as it turns out, you can't solve a problem like this with just bricks and mortar. The reasons people gave were all over the map. Some of them were pretty practical, like a fear that these small cesspits would just fill up way too quickly. And because of that, a lot of these brand new toilets were actually repurposed, for storing firewood, or grain, or even used as little sheds for goats. But then there were other reasons tied to these really deeply held beliefs, like the idea that going outside was somehow more wholesome, or even for some a sign of virility. But maybe the most powerful barrier of all is rooted deep in India's caste system. See, for centuries, the job of emptying latrines was considered impure, and it was a task that was forced upon one specific group, the Dalits, formerly known as untouchables. And this history created a powerful social roadblock. A lot of villagers were deeply reluctant to empty a latrine pit themselves, because that was the very task historically associated with the Dalits. The social stigma was too great to overcome. And as if all those social issues weren't enough, you also had corruption plaguing the program's rollout. In some areas, village heads and contractors would work together to use super cheap materials. The result? Toilets that were so poorly built, they gave people yet another reason to just not use them. But look, this isn't an unsolvable problem, not at all. And to see a different path forward, We only need to look at India's neighbor, Bangladesh. They faced a really similar crisis, and, well, they achieved some pretty remarkable results. I mean, the results of their approach really speak for themselves. Between 1990 and 2015, Bangladesh managed to reduce open defecation from 34% all the way down to just 1%. That is a stunning public health success. So the question is, what did they do differently? Well, the difference was pretty fundamental. While India's approach could sometimes be coercive, punishing offenders, Bangladesh focused on community education. Instead of just talking about health hazards, they framed sanitation as a source of dignity. And crucially, they empowered local communities, especially women, to decide where toilets should go and to lead the projects themselves. And this brings us to the real takeaway. The whole challenge, it seems, was misdiagnosed from the start. That initial assumption that this was just an infrastructure problem was, well, it was wrong. The real challenge here isn't primarily one of concrete and pipes. It was never really about that. Just hitting your construction targets, building millions of toilets. That didn't mean the problem was actually solved. No, it's a challenge of changing minds. It's about shifting these deeply ingrained social norms, the very same norms that left millions of brand new toilets sitting empty. And that is the real and frankly much harder work. So this really leaves us with a final question to think about. Is the path forward paved with toilets, or is it paved with dignity? Because as the story of India and Bangladesh shows us, solving a public health crisis might depend a whole lot less on what you build and a whole lot more on the dignity and respect you build it with. Thanks for tuning in.